Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Per President Trump's guidelines issued the beginning of this month, the Department of Justice has designated three major cities as anarchist jurisdictions. Those would be New York City, Seattle, and Portland. Those jurisdictions receiving such designation then will have the Department of Justice review the federal dollars they get in various forms and see what may be pulled back from those jurisdictions under the law. Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, following suit at the state level, he was on with Tucker Carlson the other evening, and he described what he's doing in the state of Florida on this topic against those who would destroy public property or worse.
Yeah, a number of things. I mean, you mentioned increased penalties for people who are involved in these violent demonstrations, and that includes things like toppling statutes, blocking roadways. We also have a provision that says any municipality that defunds the police, which is just an insane policy. It's like cutting off your nose to spite your face. If you do that, the state government's going to defund you. We're not going to be sending you money if you're doing things like that. We also are concerned about watching Minnesota, what happened in Minneapolis, where the mayor just abdicated responsibility, had the police stand back. That gave these folks the ability to run amok. If that happens in Florida, we're waiving sovereign immunity. You can sue the local government for damages for anything that happens to you. And then, as you mentioned, with just letting people out, we revoke bail if you're arrested for one of these offenses. And then once you make your first appearance, the presumption is you don't get bail beyond that. Because what happens in Oregon, they go in, they get their mugshot taken, and then they're right back on the street doing the same thing. Well, how is that a deterrent?
Why isn't Chicago on that list? Because that sounds like a play right out of Kim Fox's playbook.
Well, the mayor is relevant in the conversation, too, as is the police chief. David Brown, the police chief in Chicago, said just the other week about these the stream of cases of individuals who were put out on light bail after being arrested or electronic monitoring and then commit violent crimes that could have otherwise been prevented had they been remanded for trial. Chicago Police Chief David Brown, African-American gentleman, had this to say.
What are we doing? I mean, it's beyond frustrating. It makes your blood boil if you're one of those victims to a person that's out of jail on electronic monitoring that had previously 7 felonies and was arrested by Chicago police officers, and his gun was recovered for possessing an illegal gun because he's a felon in possession of a gun, and yet he's out of jail. It's beyond frustrating, but I just don't want to be the reporter. I just want to be the fact checker on this is what we are doing. We're making the arrest of people who possess illegal guns, which should make us safer. And yet every weekend we can bring forth an example of a person out of jail that should be in jail. Violent offenders need to spend more time in jail in this city. They need to be held more accountable. And
he's talking about a guy, a thug, who was out, had electronic monitoring and shot and killed 2 people.
And this was a week after an individual out on electronic monitoring stabbed a Walgreens clerk to death. We have St. Louis, reports from Post-Dispatch, St. Louis approaching historic homicide levels. Minneapolis, violent crime up 17% over the 5-year average. In Minneapolis, the NAACP, the local NAACP chapter, putting out a call for residents in predominantly black North Minneapolis to protect small business from destruction. There you have law-abiding, armed, legally, African-American residents of Minneapolis trying to protect businesses in Minneapolis as the city council, who called to defund the police, wonders aloud why police aren't responding to all the calls they're getting from residents.
And here, our homicide rate up 50% from the same time last year.
Yep.
50%.
For more on this, but from a decidedly different perspective, if I'm reading his piece in Harper's Magazine right, and I think I am, Sergio de la Pava is a legal director of New York County Defender Services and author of, most recently, the novel Lost Empress. Sergio de la Pava, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hi, good morning.
Morning. So your perspective, as I read from your time as a public defender in Manhattan, is really a sort of well, I'll let you characterize it, but it reads to me as someone who is concerned about so-called mass incarceration, supported things like the bail reform initiative that was moved by de Blasio and supported by the New York State government as well. That moving sort of nonviolent drug offenders out, more electronic monitoring, less incarceration. This is the way that big cities like New York City should be going.
Generally, that's accurate, yeah.
And so how do you react to, the stories like we were just telling, what's happening in major cities around America, as the comments you hear from a major city police chief like David Brown about people being out on electronic monitoring who are multiple convicted felons and so forth?
I mean, I think right now, I'm not breaking any ground when I say that we're at a time of civil unrest in this country. This is an unprecedented situation. I'm always offended personally when I hear about violence. It repels me. But, when we're doing things like deciding how our criminal justice system is going to operate, I don't think we can cherry pick, some admittedly outrageous actions by individuals and say, well, that's how we're going to set up our criminal justice system. I think in this country, there's anger, and a lot of it is attributable to kind of decades of, as you pointed out, mass incarceration, this notion that we can arrest and incarcerate our way out of a crime problem, and it's been debunked time and time again. So that's really as somebody who's been a public defender for 25 years, the article was designed to, kind of shine a light on something that goes underreported, which is the way we choose to police, in many ways exacerbates problems that it's seeking to solve.
In what way? Can you explain?
Well, I think in this country, poor people, certain people, marginalized members of our society feel targeted by society, targeted by police. If you look at what we refer to when we say mass incarceration, in 1973 we had about 200,000 people incarcerated. Today we have more than 2 million. It's something like a 7-fold increase in an incarceration rate. We're kind of the global leaders in incarcerating our own citizens. I think that rather than ameliorate, the social ill of crime, what this is doing is creating us versus them mentality that isn't really necessary.
But is it police are the instrumentality of lawmakers and politicians, and so, for example, in New York, I mean a notable criminal justice professor at CUNY, Michael Javon Fortner, wrote a book about this. The impetus for a crackdown on drugs and prosecution of even nonviolent drug offenses wasn't the Rockefeller administration out of whole cloth. It was the Rockefeller administration responding to law-abiding black families in majority black neighborhoods in New York City saying, we want the drug trafficking stopped in our neighborhoods. We don't feel safe. And it was sort of from the ground up that got a response from the top down.
Even if that were true, I don't think what is the most salient thing is what the genesis of a policy is. I think at any moment the question is the policy useful? Is it beneficial? Is it correct? Or is it not? And I think the decades of, you refer to the Rockefeller drug laws, which really greatly enhanced the sentences given out to nonviolent drug offenders. Right. That was an abysmal failure. In New York, more than 10 years ago at this point, walked it back and said, these sentences aren't really achieving the social goal. And I think today in New York, at least, I can only really speak expertly about New York's attitude towards this, is to view this, meaning nonviolent drug use and drug sale and activity, as a kind of almost a public health issue of, dealing with addiction and finding that the social cost of not dealing with addiction is too great. And that's where we are in New York City, where there's been a kind of rethinking of all this methodology when it comes to nonviolent drug offenses.
Well, in point of fact, I mean, we can argue from various research into the topic, but there's no question that the precipitous decline in violent crime in New York City was attendant to the rise in broken windows policing. So you can argue whether that's correlative or causative or causal, but you can't argue it didn't happen over the last 20 years until the last year or so under de Blasio.
Well, it's not even just New York City. As I mentioned in the article, really, for the last 20 years, violent crime in this country has gone down nearly 50%. Listen, I know you're going to say, "Here, look what happened 3 months ago. Look what's happening today." Again, we're right now in an unprecedented situation that really has no analog. What we're talking about, I think it's more useful to look at 20 years of data and say, "Hey, we're getting safer than it is to, focus on the last few months," which it's difficult to draw, long-range conclusions about what's happening right now. If you look at, there's been about 30 states out of 50 that have managed in the last 10 years or so to reduce their jail population while at the same time reducing crime. So there's just not this correlation that maybe people starting in the mid-'70s thought might be there between, putting more people in jail and then somehow making our society safer.
Well, I think it's really case specific. And by the way, this is not to say that there aren't great programs that help people who were incarcerated, ex-offenders, get back and onto a productive life. I mean, we talk to our friend John Ponder from Hope for Prisoners out in Vegas all the time about this topic. So we should scale programs that have shown success like his has. But, with respect to incarceration, when you're talking about violent offenders and repeat violent offenders, yeah, it seems to me you're right. You can't necessarily incarcerate your way out of endemic crime in big cities. But those long-term solutions don't eliminate the possibility of short-term removal of predators from neighborhoods. And I don't understand this perception that's being pushed that you have to choose one or the other. You have to choose some sort of criminal justice reform for nonviolent offenders, or you choose mass incarceration for everybody, rather than saying, no, it's really kind of specific. But for people who prey on other people, we're going to immediately remove you from society. And while we work on these systemic problems of family disintegration and addiction and so on and so forth.
But, at least in New York, I would start by saying, the vast majority of people incarcerated in this country have committed no violence. I agree with you. If someone is a danger to society, obviously that is priority number one for our police departments. But what you have to understand is when people try to make a kind of boogeyman out of something like bail reform in New York City reformed bail for nonviolent offenders. From the largest part of bail reform in New York City was for people charged with misdemeanors. A judge's ability to set bail on violent people accused of violent felonies in New York was unaffected. They continue to have the authority to set bail on people accused of violent felonies. So what was happening, and the reason why bail reform was deemed necessary, is that statistics were showing bail's supposed to guarantee that you, or at least to the extent possible, make it so that you return to court. And it wasn't serving that purpose. People who are arrested are presumed innocent. Judges were setting bails oftentimes in what appeared to be a racially discriminatory manner on people who had committed no violence, who were only charged with misdemeanors, and that was driving the population of our jails. Now, if you look at Rikers Island, when I started, the average population at Rikers Island, which is our our primary local jail, was about 13,000 people, sometimes 15,000, and now that population is about 5,000, and there's been no corresponding increase in violent crime or any crime really in New York City as a result of that.
Well, there had. Wait, what are you talking about? De Blasio this summer admitted. He said that bail reform probably had something to do with the spike in violent crime. There's been a massive increase in shootings and murders in New York City summer over summer this summer.
Again, there has not been a massive increase. There's been an increase during this, economic collapse / pandemic. But what I'm referring to is a 20-year process by which our 25-year process, really, by which our local jail went from 15,000 to 5,000 without a corresponding increase in crime in the city. Now, when you go to 2020 and you say, well, look at 2020 in June is worse than 2019's June. Yeah, the last explanation that I would reach for would be bail reform. I would focus on perhaps some other things that are going on at the moment.
Well, I'm just telling you what de Blasio seemed to concede that point. And by the way, since May, New York City has recorded a 140% increase in shootings as of September 2nd and a 51% increase in murders as compared to the same time last year. That is, I don't know what you define as massive, but that's massive to me.
Right, and those numbers are still far better than they were under Mayor Giuliani's broken windows policing. No?
Right. Yeah. Starting from 2,000 murders a year in the 70s, and then trending all the way down to the end of Giuliani's administration, and continuing to trend down under Bloomberg and so forth. Yeah. I'm talking more about policy than personality. I'm just saying what de Blasio admitted about his own policy that he supported. But okay. I mean, just one other point about incarcerations. This from Rafael Manguel, who's a criminologist over at Manhattan Institute. He finds through his research only about 40% of those convicted of state-level felonies are actually sent to prison. And in terms of who's in prison, 6 serious offense categories accounted for 2/3 of all state prisoners in 2018. Murder, rape, sexual assault, robbery, aggravated simple assault, burglary, and weapons offenses, with murder being the most at 14%. So, I mean, that's not, every sort of like the majority of people in prison in this country are in prison for nonviolent offenses. Those are all violent offenses. They represent 2/3 of the state prison population in this country.
You're referring to state prisoners?
Yes.
I said incarcerated individuals, which includes local county jails.
Okay.
Yeah. So I said the majority of people incarcerated, which includes local county jails, are there for nonviolent reasons. And that remains true.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, we'll leave it there. Sergio De La Pava, legal director of New York County Defender Services and author most recently of the novel Lost Empress. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
If you're talking about it, Dan and Amy are talking about it. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
When you're serious about your concealed carry training and education and are ready to learn from an active police officer with a teaching degree, check out Illinois Concealed Carry Training in Midlothian. You'll learn safe, responsible firearm use, home defense planning, conflict avoidance, situational awareness, and how to remain physically, morally, and financially safe in the event you must use your firearm in self-defense or the defense of another. Weekday and weekend classes available. For information, visit Illinois Concealed Carry Training online at icct.us. That's icct.us.
I'm Sergeant Gary Carr, police firearms trainer and the owner of Illinois Concealed Carry Training. We'll arm you with what really counts, knowledge and training. All concealed carry training programs are not created equal. This may be the single most important